a notion. You see in history, for example, suddenly a dictator rises. A dictator rises, for example. In World War II, Hitler came up. And there was a dictatorship. On all of the Khomeini, for example, over here in Iran. Assad, all the dictators that ever wrote in all the history and so on. So Bismarck and Caesar and all of them, they all rose. The Shilas, you say to yourself, why did this thing happen? Why did this thing, government that used to be, for example, a certain kind of government, a monarchy, or whatever the story is, or the guy became a dictator, the king was a beneficent king, and then he became a malevolent king, became a dictator. Why did these things happen? So, normally historians say, well, we'll tell you why this happened, because what happened was there was another fellow here who wanted to get to the throne, so he plotted against the other fellow, and it was a coup d'etat, you see, and he took over and he established a dictatorship. And that dictatorship finally ended when another war happened, and he was removed. So they attempt to look at history in terms of, that's why if you look at most history books are about the governments. You see, they're about the governments and the people who are in power. You see, that what causes history to move from one spot to another are essentially the machinations and the intrigue that continuously go on the governmental levels. You see what I'm saying? That's how most historians look at it. But the Gemara says something very different. The Gemara says in Baba Kama the following statement, that when a shepherd is angry at his flock, what he does, he blinds the leader. And when the leader is blind, the head sheep is blind, and then let's say it blunges, it falls somewhere and it hurts itself, so all the sheep follow it, they also hurt themselves. You see? So it shows a very interesting thing. That Maimon says a very interesting thing about the relationship between a government and its people. Most people think that what happens to the people is controlled by what the government wants. It's really pulfaket. When the Baruch Hashem is angry at the people, he gives them a government, you see, which will err and which cause tremendous damage. The reason why a dictator rises is not because some guy was smart enough in a coup d'etat to take over, but the reason why a dictator rises is because the people at that time were nenash, and by being nenash, the Baruch Hashem put on top of them some dictator to do that. It is the reverse. History is not run by governments. History is run by people. People determine governments, not by their votes, you see, or not by their support, but by their meisim. If they're meisim tovim or they're meisim roim. That's which fundamentally determines who the malachim, the melech will be on them, and what kind of policies he will have. Now, here's a statement in the Gemara, which is a very important thing. You see, that one statement alone instantly invalidates the entire way that historians look at reality, doesn't it? Because it says you think that the head is over there and the tail is over there, and I'll tell you fakat. The head is there and the tail is over here. You see, that's where it is. Which means that the Torah is looking at it from a different angle. That's an example of a maimah in the Torah which has consequences for political science. But it's a very critical statement. You see. Now, what we're going to do tonight is attempt to analyze, what are we attempting to understand? We're attempting to understand the Goyim, the Ummah Sa'olam, all the different peoples in the world, right? Essentially, which Chokhmah does that fit into most, basically? Anthropology. Because anthropology is the study of mankind, basically, in his entirety. All the different kinds of ethnic groups. What anthropology wants to study is the following. We look at all the different races of mankind, the different ethnic societies of mankind, and we want to understand, why are these people different than these people? For example, the Zulu in Africa have a certain culture. They have certain laws, they have certain marital ceremonies, they have certain legal and ritual rites, they have certain ways of behaving with each other, and so on and so forth. It's what's called a culture. That's their culture. They value certain things and other things are not important to see. That is a culture. The culture of the Zulu is very different, for example, than the culture of the Eskimo. Drastically different. Which is very different than the culture of a European. Which is very different, let's say, than the culture of a Pacific Islander. Why do different peoples have different cultures? That's what anthropologists want to know. So what they do, they go about it in a very smart way. They study the concept called culture, right? The idea called culture, and they fragment it according to its various different elements, and they say, now let's see, what is the culture over here? Let's analyze in terms of its various elements, and the culture over here, and so on, and let's see what they all have in common. And if we understand what they all have in common, right, then we understand what is it about human nature that determines culture. If we analyze all cultures and we see that there's a certain aspect of culture which they all have in common, we can begin to understand what is about human nature that's common or general to all mankind. You see what I'm saying? That's what they do. But the other point is, even though you may see certain commonalities among culture, but you will also see certain substantial differences, correct? What caused the differences? So, they'll say the following. The differences are probably caused by environment. You see, environment, for example, where the people live. In terms of the needs, environment where people live determines a great deal about their shelter, how they get their food, what their recreations are, and so on and so forth. You see? So that's what they try and do. They try and explain all the different cultures of mankind. By virtue, they try and say by virtue that there's something called human nature, and it's human nature in a certain sense, which creates the absolute elements in a culture, and then there's something called the environmental factors, which cause the relative differences among culture. You see? That in a sense is a logical mahalach what to do. And of course, they try and do this in a systematic way. But we ask ourselves a very interesting question. How does Torah explain all this? How does Torah explain the vast array of human culture throughout the world and throughout history? The idea that we're trying to understand is a concept called culture, which, as I said to you, are the values and essential societal behavior patterns of a specific segment of mankind. How does Torah explain different cultures? As it must in some way, because these cultures are in some way the product of the Hashgacha Pratis. Okay. Last week we spoke about the Indian of a Goy, of Ben Olam Hazer, and we said that because of the fact that the individuals in the time of Noach, around that time, Noach by Avon and so on, because of their Maisim Moim, because they were Rishayim, they lost the ability to be Mekadesh the Bria and bring the Bria up to Madreg of Olam Haba. They lost that. However, the question is, did they all lose it in the same way? You see, did they all lose it in the same way, or there are differences in the way they lost it?
There was some good guy.
What?
There was some good guy.
The answer is there were differences in the way they lost it. And what happened in the time of Noach, around that time, and so on, when the Mitzvah Hadin looked down on the world and it evaluated all the different peoples of the world, right? Or in terms of our flogger, or especially in terms of all the shroshim, right? The people who had the koyach and so on, and that world, it noticed a very interesting thing, that there were 71 distinct levels. You see. There were 70 distinct levels, and there was a 71st. Is it cold now? Shut up. Me, this I didn't know this was a very interesting thing. But there were 71 madregas, or degrees, and so on. Now, what was the difference? The 71st was distinguished from the 70th in the 7th line. That the 71st one, madrega, referred to the individual who was a very big tzaddik. You see. And when the Midas Hadin looked at him, he said, wait a minute, that person, because of his maisim, has the koyach, what? To mezachach the world, to mekadosh the bria. He still has that koyach which was given to Adam Rishon. You see. What about everyone else? When the Midas Hadin looked around all the other shvashim, it says, no one else has the koyach. They all lost the koyach. All of them are below the minimal threshold in terms of maisim tovim, which are required to raise the world to a level of Olam Haba. You see, which means that the Mitzvah Hadin said on all of them, let's withdraw Kedusha. So what it did is, it withdrew Kedusha. It withdrew Kedusha from all 70 levels. Now the question is, did it withdraw it in the same way? Well, fundamentally in a certain way it did. All of them became the same, in the sense that every one of these 70 levels, right? Every one of these 70 levels had no shaykhs anymore to Olam Haba. However, there were 70 levels, which means that even though there were many different points here, but there were certain levels, umas, shloshim, and from these shloshim, of course, came nations, full nations. You see, there were 70 shloshim, and therefore there were shivim umas. You all notice the Torah talks about the shivim umas, the 70 nations. The 70 nations essentially were the following. You see, even though there were 70, and all 70 no longer had the koyach of Adam Rishon, but they still differed, because the ones that were closest to number 71, you see, still retained some aspects of Kedusha, and the ones that were at the bottom of the pile contained very minimal aspects. You see, this created therefore the distinction between the 70 nations, and these what's called the Shivim Umas, or the 70 nations.
When did this happen?
This happened about by the time of Noach, by the door of Flaga.
Everybody disappeared.
What?
You mean that after the Mabul?
After the Mabul. No, after the Mabul, yes. No, before the Mabul, well, see, that was the thing. We won't go to this right now. See, the concept of before the Mabul was the following. That when Adam Rishon did the Chet, right? When he did the Chet, the Midas Hadin wanted Ibud, because he lost the thing. The Midas HaYichud said, no, let's give him another chance. So what he was supposed to do himself now was fragmented to many other peoples. When all those people failed to do that, what the Midas Hadin said, well, let's ma'abad them. You see, so what the Banishim did was that he looked around and all the people, and he only saw that Noach was the only tzaddik around, and the rest of them had no shaykhs to what? To the Indian of Adam Rishon. But the Midas Hadin at that point said the following, that as long as there exist some people with the Indian of Adam Rishon, it is possible to destroy the rest. So that's why the Mabul was able to come in the world. Because the Midas Hadin at that time was in a form when the Banishim was able to be Ma'abad Olam on Pidin. As long as there was someone left. There always had to be someone left. You see, after Noach, what the Banishim said was the following, that never again will I destroy the world. Meaning the following. It means that even if the world falls below the threshold, it means even if the children of Noach, and that's how it's started anew, falls below the threshold, right? I will not destroy those umas that are below the threshold just because they no longer have the aspect of Adam Rishon. Instead, I will retain them according to their madrigas. And they will become the Indian of a goy. You see? The concept of a goy did not exist before the Mabul. Because anyone who wasn't there, anyone who couldn't make it, wasn't there. Was removed. That's why there was a Mabul. The Banishim destroyed all those who could not make, who refused to make it. They had Bechira. You see, after the Mabul, the mitzvah didn't change. Yes. The actuality of a goy didn't come, but the machshava, the potential, the possibility of a goy came after the Mabul. Before the Mabul, there was no possibility of a goy. There was nothing in the Midas HaYichud which even allowed a goy to exist. You see, even the Rachamim did not allow for a goy. Why? Because the Rachamim said, let's save Noach. But the rest...
In other words, someone who's not a Masakim, not a Tzufa, Tachas Olam, that from the time of Noach afterwards will be allowed to exist even though he's not participating.
Right.
He's not a player.
Essentially.
In other words, he's also potential.
Also Rachman, but he doesn't do anything.
Right, you know, the Rachamim before the Mabul could not sustain even an Indian of a guy. Because the world was in a very powerful, the world before the Mabul was in a very high madrega.
It was close to Adam Rishon.
Which means that the Neshamas were incredibly powerful. You see, the Shloshim were very great. You see, and because of the fact that the world was in such a koyach, you see, then because of that, the Churbanos were very powerful. The Hashchos of the Bria was very, very powerful at that time. So the Rachamim functioned on a minimal scale.
So that means Noach Neshama was also very powerful, because actually all the Neshamas were fragmented after him.
Noach was the Mashiach ben Yosef in his time. He had the mamash the shirish of the Mashiach ben Yosef.
Because the Neshamas were fragmented from him later on.
Later on, right.
Because everything till then was destroyed.
It was destroyed, exactly.
What did he have to do to, let's say, bring Olam Haba?
Well, that's the whole shaila. Obviously, what you see from there, just as an aside, see, that's the concept is it's a very mysterious point over there, and here's where you see the whole aside, I don't know if I should go, is a very, the concept here is that the concept of the, remember I explained previously that that the whole concept of the Bria is contained in the idea of the two Mashiachim, the Mashiach ben David and the Mashiach ben Yosef. That the whole tachlis of Adam Rishon was the inyan of Mashiach ben David, and that tachlis was to take the Bria, the world as it existed, and be mekadosh it, mezachach it. But once the Bria went down to a level of Tumah, there had to be a new Aliyah, which first you have to go from Tumah to Tyra, and then from Tyra to Kedusha. The process in which the world goes from Tumah to Tyra is called Mashiach ben Yosef. That's the name of the process. And the process where the world goes from Tyra to Kedusha is called Mashiach ben David. Now the interesting question is, and that symbolizes the tikkun of Nam Neksufa throughout all time. And anything in the world is either occupied with one or the other process. There are no other processes. That's it. So,
who was Mashiach ben David?
the tikkunim therefore take place in the Tvei Mashiachim. The concept of the Tvei Mashiachim, you see, reflect the two fundamental processes which occupy all of creation and all of history from the time of Adam Rishon to the end of Yom Adin. You see, now, but we see the following: that what happens is that the process is not the same in every generation. So if the process is not the same, obviously the individuals who become the Mashiach and who have the potential are also not the same. Which means that by Noach there was only a Mashiach ben Yosef. Where was the Mashiach ben David? What? Whatever. How was being manifest? This is a mysterious point. What was the inyan of Mashiach ben David at that time?
His son Shem.
Who? His son Shem. Obviously, right. Sometimes the kochos on his harav. Sometimes they split. Obviously, this.
Well, he could have been like by Adam Rishon. He was both Mashiach. Well, Adam Rishon.
No, it was only one. You see, that's the whole thing.
Mr. Shelach also.
Mr. Shelach and so on. But you see, what you see is the thing, and I make a very broad statement, and you can all understand what I'm about to say. That the entire study of the Torah, of the all Nach, you see, is really nothing more in a sense, or the fundamental goal. One of the besides the Maitim, but the fundamental goal when you learn Nach is to understand how the tikkunim of the Tvei Mashiachim take place in every generation.
Identification of them.
Well, it's not so much the identification of who the kind of people are. It's more closely the identification of how the process is being manifest in each generation. That's really what it is. Because the whole mystery lies in the process. That's the clue. If you can put your finger on what the process is in each generation, you can understand the basic roots of the entire Hashgacha process at that time and how it influenced the next generation. Do you all understand this?
But there's only one process going on at a time.
Who?
The process of Mashiach ben Yosef. Because obviously there's no Mashiach ben David.
Well, there's
only one process going on.
There's a big problem. Like when we had the Shira,
Right.
Moshe Rabbeinu, who was, Mashiach ben David at that time.
Yeah, but there could be two Mashiachim, but there's only one process.
Well, I'm not going to go into that. That's a very difficult study in its own. But this is what it is. It's fundamentally, it's the identification of the processes in each generation. For example, in the time of Yerovam ben Nevat, just a brief thing, Yerovam ben Nevat, you see, and just as an aside, I'll get back, Yerovam ben Nevat, well, you have David HaMelech, obviously was the Koyach Mashiach from David. Yerovam ben Nevat, who was, and so on, Yerovam ben Nevat, and the one who was governing at the time of David was Achitophel. And Yerovam ben Nevat was set up as the Melech of the 10 tribes, and Achitophel, who was one of the Zerah David, was set up as the Melech of Yehuda, and so on. And this was done with the Rishus of the Rebbeinu Shem. The Rebbeinu Shem wanted this, because Achia Shiloni, who was a Navi, went to Yerovam and said that the Rebbeinu Shem has told me that you will become a Melech. Where do I come to Malchus? I'm not Mizerah David. Oh, but you are Mizerah Yosef. You are the Mashiach ben Yosef in your time, you see. And Yosef had Shaykh to Malchus. The only two that had Shaykh to Malchus is Yosef and Yehuda, and so on, you see. And since you have the union of Yosef, and so on, you are the Mashiach ben Yosef, and Achitophel is Mashiach ben David. So that's what happened when Yerovam ben Nevat said to him, and that's the medrash, that Yerovam, when the Rebbeinu Shem said to, so Yerovam, what happened, there was a whole ma'aseh there that he was very jealous of Achitophel because he had a bigger covered in the Beit HaMikdash. The question was, there's several different things. What's that? So what happened? Yerovam ben Nevat became a choyte machtas Rabim. He began to din avodah zarah, and he caused all the 10 tribes to also din avodah zarah. So the problem was, so the Baruch Shem said to Yerovim, he says, do tshuva, and you, I, and Ben David will all walk in the Gan Eden. So Yerovim Ben said, me Baruch, but who's going to go first? Not meaning me or the Baruch Shem, meaning me or the you see, now, what he meant wasn't David HaMelech. Most people learn that meant because I'm David HaMelech. It was going on Achitophel. It means, the Baruch Shem is saying, you do tshuva, and therefore, if you do tshuva, then the Yemoisa Mashiach will start with you. That's what the Baruch Shem is saying. It means the Tikkun of the Bria will be established with you. You and who else? You are the Mashiach ben Yosef, and Achitophel is the Mashiach ben David. You see? So Yerovim said, but who's first? Who's the bigger the Mashiach? So the Baruch Shem said, and that when he said first, not who's the biggest, but who's going to go first? So the Baruch Shem says, Ben David. And he didn't want to do that. His gaiva got to him and so on, and that kind of sense, he fell and so on, and there was a tremendous kilkel. The kilkel came out of it, that because of the chet of Yerovim ben Nevat, because of that chet, what happened was, he had done that avodah zarah, and the chet that he did was so powerful, that he damaged the neshama of the Mashiach ben Yosef, which is a very, very bad thing to do. Why? Because the shirish, or the neshama of the Mashiach ben Yosef, the neshama of that Mashiach, is the neshama that's supposed to be masakin for all Klal Yisrael. It's supposed to be bring the tikkun for all the other neshamas which are damaged. But what happens if it itself becomes damaged? You see what I'm saying? This is a terrible kilkel in the Bria. So what happened was, the Baruch Shem found that the actual neshama of the Mashiach ben Yosef itself, or the Yechida, or the neshama which crowns the thing, was taken away. It didn't come down, it wasn't damaged, but the shirish, or the power of the neshama of the Mashiach ben Yosef was damaged. And in order to, and when it was damaged, what does it mean that it was damaged? What does it mean that it was damaged? It means because of the chet, it was damaged. So therefore, the oris that came to that neshama left the and it had to go somewhere else. Where? It had to go into the hands of the Goyim, other places. Now, if you remember last week when we described very quickly how to get that back, one way that you get it back, to retrieve it, is when a Jew suffers at the hands of a guy, or when he dies at the hand of a guy. That's when it was nigzat that the Mashiach ben Yosef would die. You know the Gemara in Sukkot. The Gemara says that Mashiach ben Yosef was supposed to die. So everyone thinks, what do you mean Mashiach ben Yosef was going to die? Everyone thinks in this way, and this is incredible, not on everyone thinks. When I mean everyone, I'm talking about the Acharonim, the Rishonim who think this way. And what they hold is like this, is that the emphasis, the Mashiach ben Yosef is an individual, not on the Rishonim, but the Acharonim hold this, that the Mashiach ben Yosef is an individual who will attempt to bring a gul to Klal Yisrael, but will fail. Why? Because he lacks the ability to be a true Mashiach. You see, he's like a half Mashiach. And since he lacks the ability, he will fail, and he will die. You see. And therefore, who will come over to take over? Who's after Mashiach ben Yosef? Then the Mashiach ben David comes, and he brings the whole gula. But that is not true. That's not what happens. What really happens, and you find what the Ramchal says, it's not that there is no difference in the neshama of Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David. You see, because they both refer to the same process, in a sense, or one half of the process, and each one is as powerful as the other. There are no differences. In fact, they're called tumim or twins. You see, so then the question is, why did Mashiach ben Yosef die? The answer is Mashiach ben Yosef was never supposed to die. How can? Of course not. The reason why he died is because the begam of Yerovim ben Nevat. That's why. So in order to be masakin, the begam of the Mashiach ben Yosef itself, he had to die at the hands of Goyim. You see. So what I'm trying to say, I'm trying to answer your question, how does it affect? You see, the Messiah, how does the Tikkunim affect it? You see, in other words, every generation is involved in these two processes. Now, if these two processes, something goes wrong, suddenly it affects a tremendous thing. Because what happened was, not only, when you opened the Chet, not only was it nigzat that the Mashiach ben Yosef has to die, you see, but it was nigzat that the 10 Shvatim would have to go with the Golas. That is their death. You see. Now, when the 10 Shvatim were lost, and they were taken off by Sancheirav, right? What is that? That is the process of the Mashiach ben Yosef. You see what I'm saying? That is how the process of Mashiach ben Yosef happened in that generation. That's the tikkun of the kilkel.
The goals?
Yes. The tikkun of the kilkel. We've gone off on a real tangent, but I just want to give you an idea of what we're talking about over here, in that sense. But let's go back to our original subject.
Next question, by Noah, right? Why is it that these people were such powerful neshamas and everything, right? And they had such a strong sense of bechira, much more than we have today, right? Why is it that they all failed except for these 8 people or whatever?
You know, except for the things.
How could that be?
That's
But Yitzhahara was also very strong at that time.
There's an implied. The thing is that they all had bechira and they all failed in terms of their bechira. There's an implied question what you're asking there, which is it's a difficult question it's an implied question because it has to do with the probability factor on individuals versus the group. You're gonna drag me to another side here, which is just to go into the question, which I'm not going to answer now. It's a very difficult thing to answer. One of the most difficult things of all, really, to answer, and that's a very strange thing. That when you look collectively at the world always seems to fail. Right? When you look at the Ummah or if you looked at the Bria, it always seems to fail. How do we know? Because if it didn't fail, we wouldn't be here now. We're almost down here to the end. Now, how did we get here? We got here because everyone seemed to fail along the line. There was a series of failures. So, but the probability on anything, if Bechira is a 50-50 split, the probability says that 50-50 means out of 10 chances, 5 is going to fail and 5 is going to pass. Yet we find that on a 50-50 split, 10 fails. You see. But you find on a collective level, therefore, it's much more difficult. And that has to do with the nature of the collective level. On the individual level, you find it much better. Because you find that, for example, Avraham Avinu went to 10 nisyonos, right? He passed all 10. But probability says that he would fail 5. So whenever you look at the tzaddik is always passing, the yochid, and the tzibur is always failing. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a very strange concept. It's a strange contrast. Now why that is, happens to be the nature of the tikkun which is established by the yochid versus the tikkun that's established by the tzibur. And that's a whole different thing. That has a lot to do with the fragmentation of the... That has a lot to do with the fragmentation of the neshama of Adam Rishon, and how all neshamas collectively have to work together to restore that which Adam himself damaged as a single individual, who's once the collective of all these neshamas. Whereas it's easier for the individual.
I mean, there's not only quantitative fragments, the qualitative difference. What about the probability factor of being material conscious?
But yeah, that's a problem. But it's a problem. It is a problem. There's a problem in that kind of sense. But we find it's difficult reality. But it's no question. It's something which is problematical.
Let me respond to one thing.
But it doesn't matter. The point is that there is a bechira here. There is definitely bechira here, and there is an aspect when you can pass or fail. You see, there's no question about it. All those people in the time of Noach had the ability to pass or fail. They didn't have to fall.
One thing I want to mention before we go into the traffic break is that in reference to the Dara Marvel, if in fact that check the Kisvei around that, if they're in this dialogue back in
that came from Adam and it transformed something to become a truly evil being. What does that mean? It means that the Satan no longer could be Masig Yechudai. The Satan who's a Malach cannot be Masig Yechudai. Now normally, in order to do that to a person or to a neshama, the Baruch Hashem takes a neshama and puts it into a guf. And in the guf, the person cannot be Masig Yechudai. He cannot see Enod Mavadai. You see. But how do you do that to a Malach? The Satan wasn't put into a guf. Well, in a sense it was. But fundamentally what happened was that the Satan was changed from the inside, so that its very nature was transformed. As soon as it had these new Oros of Kedusha, suddenly it became transformed and it became an evil malach. There was suddenly a wall that was drawn between the Satan and the Baruch Shalom. It could no longer see the Baruch Shalom clearly. And because it could not perceive the Baruch Shalom clearly, you see, it harbored thoughts of Yeshoid Mavadoi. Me, I will become the Melech and I will take over the world. The Satan really believes that as he comes to the point when he's able to cause all of mankind to be chayta, eventually he will be sustained l'netzach nitzachim. Wait a minute, that's his belief. You see. Now, what caused that transformation was the Hanogas HaYichud. When man did the chait, you see, the Hanogas HaYichud instantly became activated. enlarged and transformed the Satan into a different being, a purely evil being. No longer was the Satan as a shaliach of the Hanagas Mishpat, just to seduce man and to persecute him in terms of kitrug and to bring him to din. The Satan now has a vested interest in seeing that the person falls, because the more you fall, the stronger I become. It's you against me. And this is what happened. The Satan became twisted in such a way that there was an actual competition that was set up. This is incredible. Before, the Satan was a malach doing the shlichus. That's all. Now the Satan became a direct competitor against man. And it is a Satan versus man directly. As if it was a head-on collision. It's mortal combat. The Satan says, either you survive or I survive. We both cannot survive. And I will do everything I can to destroy you. That's mamash what it is. It's a vested interest. What made this something like that? The Rebbeinu Shalom did. The Hanagas Hayicha did. Why? Because not for the fact that the Satan became evil and a competitor to man and subject to the concept of Yeshua Mavadoi and a murdered man would never be able to go back to this state. Now, why that is, I'm not going to go into that now. That goes into the whole concept of Hanagas Hayichud. Therein lies one of the biggest mysteries. It's an irony, but one of the biggest mysteries of all creation. Now, you say to me, where do I know all this from? Besides the Sefer, it's an open pasuk. It's an open pasuk that such a thing happened. You see, where? Because it says in the pasuk. After the Chet of Adam Rishon, what did the Banishim do? In the Chet of Adam Rishon, in this time, the Satan was not like here. In another sense, the Satan was represented by the Nachash. What does that mean? You had an animal called a snake. Now, it was a snake, it was a Nachash. It didn't look exactly like a snake, but had certain similar properties, and so on. But the snake was different, in the sense that the koyach of the Satan, of the koyach of the Pitoi, was vested in a certain organism called a snake. Never again was such a thing. That's because the Satan, as we said, was outside of the Bria. The Bria was Tohor. The Satan was not in the Bria, he was outside. But he was able to go into the Bria or manipulate the Bria through the Nachash. You see, the Nachash became his representative or his Shaliach, and the Nachash started talking to Chava. But fundamentally, the Shorish of the Nachash or the Koyach that was Machayim came from the Satan itself. That's why we say that the Nachash was the Satan. But he wasn't directly the Satan, he was a Shaliach of the Satan. You see, after the Chet, what did the Banishim say to the Nachash? Ela ofo toshu. You see, the al gechoynech telech. Not over the al gechoynech telech. You see, and what the Banishim cursed him in several ways. The Nachash, he said to the Nachash, first of all, al gechoynech telech. I will cut off your feet, and you will walk crawl on the ground. Number one, and you will always be at war with men. You see, what does it mean? I will cut off your feet. It means, the Banishim said, I will cut your feet, so you will no longer look up as a malach, as a regular malach, but I will cut your feet, and you will be the only malach that looks down. You will be the only malach that looks away from me, because you will be the only malach that has the possibility or the havmina of Yeshua Mulvadoi.
It doesn't work through the Nachash anymore.
No, not anymore. No, he doesn't work through the Nachash. But what the Banishim said about the Nachash was symbolically, he was talking about the Satan, not the Nachash. But since the Nachash was the personification of the Satan at that time, it took in the Klala in terms of its body. But the Klala wasn't the etzem body of the Satan, of the Nachash. The Banishim didn't curse the snake and said, I'm taking away your feet, and you're going to start crawling on the ground. What is that? I mean, he didn't disfigure the body of the Nachash, he disfigured the Satan himself.
But the Satan did the job.
No, yes.
He did the job at the time.
He said Sheker, he didn't do the job. He told her that the music collector.
No, he did. Yeah, but
that's what he lied. He was already.
That's a different story. But he was mutter to do that. The point is.
So why was he punished?
No, he wasn't punished. No, he was not punished. Hold on 1 second. No. Now, when the Satan came from here to here, he was not punished. He was transformed by the Hanagas Hayichud, not as an Einish. No. It doesn't mean that he was punished. Chas v'shalom, the Satan was not ne'nash at all, because he did his job. His job was to seduce Chava. What?
Why was it changed?
Wait a minute, hold on. One step at a time. One concept at a time. The Nachash was transformed. You see this in the pasuk itself, where the Banishim said you lose your feet, meaning that you no longer, your Shirish, which is the Satan himself, will no longer have its koyach of being a regular malach. Instead, you will be a malach of the earth. You will be a malach of Olam Hazeh, which means that you will be restricted in the same way as man is in the possibility of thinking Yeshua Mavadoi. You see. Do we understand this point? You see this often in the pasuk itself, and it says because of the fact you will now be at war with man. What does one have to do with the other, really? You see, why does suddenly the Nachash become at war with man? Because that's the thing. Once the Satan becomes Ois Malach in the conventional sense, he's not doing the shlichus of the Bonisham directly anymore in terms of the mishpat. You see, rather what he's doing now, once he's perverted the Noma Malach, and he himself is subject to the Torahs of Yeshua Mavadoi, you see, he's now subject to do things on his own or because of himself. So the question is, he's now competing with man in terms of the Uris. Who takes the Uris? You or me? I will fight for you. You see, when I was originally a Malach Kodosh, I'm not fighting with man, I'm doing the job of the Bonisham. I have no shaykhs to man. But now that I'm transformed, and I'm an evil being, and I believe in Yeshua Mavadoi, I need those Uris to survive. I need those Uris to be Moed B'Malchus. I need them. Where do I get them? There's only one way I can get them. I can only get them from man. And I must get them from man by continuously being at war with him to seduce him as much as possible to the chet, so that I will kind of those Uris.
In other words, like someone says, don't need Chashav Devaisha for my
nourishment
anymore.
He doesn't need the Bonisham anymore. Now,
at this point, then the Satan is a Baal Bechira.
Yeah, no, he's not a Baal Bechira. No, he's not a Baal Bechira. He has. Now we go to the second point. Do we understand the transformation of his personality? That's number one. Now the question is, who transformed him? The Bonisham transformed him. How? Through the Hanagas HaYichud. It was the Hanagas HaYichud which transformed him. According to Hanagas HaMishpat, he's fine as a regular Malach. The Hanagas HaYichud said that in order to save man, we must transform the Satan into a different being. If we don't transform the Satan into a different being, then man must be destroyed. You see, we'll get to the logic later. That was the conclusion. So what the Hanagas HaYichud did, it transformed the Satan into a totally different kind of Malach. And that was the Indian of it lost its feet. Now, that had nothing to do with the Satan himself. He didn't do it to himself. One day he woke, just like Adam when he woke up after the Chet, and he saw he was a different person, but he was a different person by virtue of what he did. The Satan the next morning woke up and suddenly said, "Where's my feet?" In other words, what he really meant was, he woke up the next morning and said, "Wait a minute, I feel differently about everything. Kedusha? Fact. I'm out to get this thing. We have to claim the kingdom for ourselves, you see." Now, he doesn't realize this about himself. He didn't know this. One day he was this thing, the next thing he was Jekyll. One day he was Mr. Jekyll, the next day he's Mr. Hyde. You see, he didn't accomplish this transformation himself. You see, he didn't realize that, no, this was done over and above his realization. Suddenly one day he was a representative of Hanagas HaMishpat. The next day he was a representative of Hanagas HaYichud, which made him into an evil, totally evil being. You see, forget it 1 minute why. I don't want to go into why. Just understand what I'm saying in terms of what happens here. You see, it was necessary for the tikkun and the kiyum of the world to transform the Satan this way. And he woke up the next day and he found himself. Now Adam woke up the next day and found himself also in the same situation. Except Adam was responsible for where he was, because he's the one who had Bechira.
He knew why.
Yes. So what happened was, Adam dragged the entire Bria down with him. He dragged the Bria, he dragged himself, his neshama, which is fragmented, he dragged his guf, and he dragged the Satan down with him. You see, Adam owes apology to the Satan himself. It sounds, this really comes out. But the end of the zach is that Adam Rishon, or whoever comes there, everyone who does the chet, Mama has to do up a kapor for the hashchasa that he wrought in Satan himself. It sounds weird, it sounds bizarre, in a sense. Look, we're not promoting Satan worship here. But we're promoting the concept. Now you get the kasha. But it says at the end that by the Moshe Mashiach, the Bonisham is going to come along and he's going to kill the Satan. He's going to shecht him, he's going to kill him. So if the Satan is not responsible for what he's doing, in some way, what is the Bonisham killing him for? So I answered this question, and then I found the same thing I said in something the Baal Shem Tov had said. He said the exact same thing. He said the following: when it says the Bonisham will kill the Satan, it doesn't say he's going to kill the Satan with Ritzicha. It says he's going to shecht the Satan. That's what it says. Now, Shchita, what does Shchita do? Shchita is a hariga, it's a Ritzicha that's mesaken. Because it makes something kosher. It's mesaken, the neshama, or whatever is inside the animal. What the Bonisham will do to the Satan is mesaken the Satan. Those are the Shilas, that's what he's going to do. He's going to transform the Satan. The Shilas, what did he transform the Satan for? He's transforming that which Adam was makalkel the Baruch Shem would reinstate. When? By the Yemos Mashiach. Just like in the time of the Yemos Mashiach, the kilkel of the Bria will leave. In the time of the Yemos Mashiach, the Satan will go back to what he was before. You see, and become the original Satan that he was by Adam Rishon. A tikkun and a transformation.
Back to what we,
yes.
where we started.
So exactly. In other words, what will go back from Adam Rishon, what will go back from the Yemos Mashiach to the state of Adam Rishon, which is what we said Yemos Mashiach is a complete transformation, a complete, what do you call it, rehabilitation or tikkun. Totally. Yes, the whole Bria goes back to where it was. You see, and it even goes back, the Satan goes back to where it was. And when that day happens, it's Emes Zachas, I mean, it's an amazing thing. But when that happens, suddenly it's going to go the other way, and the Satan one day he's going to wake up. It's like Chonia Magal, who slept for 70 years. Suddenly the Satan's going to wake up and says, where have I been? You know what? It's like a person who was compelled to do something. Suddenly like some kind of a force entered his body, and like a shed entered his body, and he suddenly had to do all kinds of crazy things. And the Satan's going to wake up and realize, wait a minute, what happened over here?
So his job will be then just to give the fear then.
What's that?
His job will be...
His job will simply go back to the original thing and so on. But even that will be changed to a large extent, you see. But his whole koyach will be taken away. Now I want you to notice the important parallels here, how the thing fits exactly. The Bria is Mekakal here, the Satan is Mekakal, but he's Mekakal because of the Kedusha that comes out of the Chet, you see. And that increases the Tumah and the Bria. And the Indian of going from here to here is the Indian of Yosef, which is removing the Tumah or the Tara, or being Matara. It removes the Tumah by bringing the Bria back to a state of Chasson, basically to a state of Tahara. But in order to do that, it has to Matara the Satan. You Matara Satan by taking away this Kedusha. And that's the whole key. The Kedusha must come back. You see. Now the old basic what I've left out and I've not answered is, why was it necessary to transform the Sifra Achra? You see, why? I won't answer that tonight, but I do want to say one thing. How was it possible that the Satan was capable of the Torah of Yeshed Milvadoi? How do you take a Malach, and a Malach thinks that it could be something else besides the Bnei Shalom? You do it in the following way.
He has so much Kedusha.
What's that?
He has too much Kedusha.
No, but I'll tell you what, I'll give a break for a couple of minutes, okay?
He brings down Kedusha.
Yes, he brings it down into the Klippa. That's the meaning of Golus. And so on. But we won't go into that. But that's what happens. He's mechazik the Sifra Achra. He's mechazik the Tumah by infusing it with Kedusha.
What you're saying in a way is that the Kedusha and life or existence itself is mamish the same thing.
Asadan. Exactly.
Everything Lamata is Lamala Lamayla. That's
Yeah, and it's fine.
And this is without the Smalach Mechayis, it can't exist. So it only has a Chiyas and Kedusha.
Also, at one point.
It's a shock, isn't it? Someone, is this Judaism? It's an amazing thing. The truth of the matter is that what I've covered tonight essentially is not written anywhere. Basically, it's not. You will not find this in a sefer. Period. But that's it. The Ramchal doesn't say at all what that means or when does it. Nothing. This is total mystery, really. You see. But I'm trying to explain to you what it means that he was married. Why? Where it comes from. Its connection to the entire thing and so on. And throughout the entire Bria, what that Merida is.
It's tied to Hashem Yichud as being the function of the way that Hashem Yichud is working.
That's what it means to be right. He's never responsible for what's going on. He's always doing the job of the Baruch Shem. But there's two kinds of jobs. Either he's working for Anogas HaMishpat, which is the Mitzvah Din, or he's working for the Mitzvah HaLachamim, or the Mitzvah Chet called Anogas HaYichud. That he's working for either one. But he doesn't know it. One day he's got one job, the next day he's on a different job. And he's not even aware of it. But the funny thing is, the job that works for the Mitzvah HaLachamim is to turn him into a totally evil being. Now that sounds like a contradiction. See, that's a different limit, but that's what happened. That's exactly what happened.
Where does he reside? He could have been doing all of this even without a Merida also.
Who?
No, why not? The more Kedusha he gets, the stronger he becomes, so the more evil he brings in.
Yes,
but
yes.
He doesn't have to know a Merida.
Yes, that's so.
I don't see why he has to...
I didn't explain that. I left that point out, why it is he has to be murdered and so on.
The whole thing could go along without a Merida also.
Yes. Well, it looks like that. It cannot, but that's what it looks like. Obviously, the Anogas Yichud needed that transformation.
That's Merida. That's the Kudo.
He needed an Akuda where the Satan became Ra. Not only Tomei, but he became evil. There's an Indian of... You see, that's an Indian of Ra, besides Tumah, that came into the Bria with this kind of transformation. So the Satan became an evil being. Just like the Bnei Shem is a Tevya Meitiv, the Satan is a Ra Umeria.
But you didn't explain why he has...
No. That's the one thing I explained. I simply explained the concept of transformation, and what I'll explain after this is the the nature of the transformation, how that exactly happened. How is it that how is it that a malach can believe in Yeshua Milvadoi and not be Master Yechudoi? How does that work?
And be Shema. I mean, malach is close to Elijah.
Yeah,
and he's still rebels. That's
incredible.
Yes. How do all the malachim tolerate it?
It has to because he has
Can't be smaller than them all.
What's the alternative to the malach?
Where does he reside? Does he reside among? Does he go and say shira every day like all the other malachim?
So what's his head?
He doesn't.
He says Shiva to himself.
So what does he do?
He says shira to him.
Well, I mean, he's a Murid, he's a Murid.
Obviously, they don't understand.
They don't have it half right.
They have everything forget the whole
I show you that we'll go, I have to go show you that how the Christians had it wrong and how they missed the whole point. Because the concept that an evil being could still be used in the Shlichus of Rebbeinu Shalom is the biggest raya for Engel Yisrael. It's the biggest Indian of Hanagas Ayichah. You mean?
Why should
But even the evil doesn't do the Rebbeinu Shalom.
do a good job?
Our thing that we want to deal with here is what was the mechanism essentially that allowed this transformation to take place. The one thing we have not discussed tonight is the reason for this transformation. That has to do with what you were asking. We haven't discussed the reason. We're concerned here simply with stating the fact that there was such a transformation, you see, and what the nature of that transformation is. And now we want to understand the mechanism of that transformation. How do you take a malach and give him a Yetzer Hara, in essence? This is what you do. So that he has a pause. You have to remember, the Yetzer Hara has no bechira. You see, he must attempt to do what he does. He doesn't have a choice of good or bad. He either, all malachim serve the function of kedusha. You see, the Yetzer Hara here we're given a new function to serve the concept of Ra, but he's still a malach, except in a transformed state. Now the shayla is, why is it that he's not Master Yechud in that kind of sense? He's a malach in that kind of sense. So the way I understand it and so on, and is the following. Does anyone want to give an attempt at teretz on that? It's a hard one.
What do you mean by the mechanism?
How does he do it? How does a certain believe in Yeshua Milvadoi? How do you maneuver that?
You allude to it. For number one,
Yeah.
To live.
What? Yeah, how do you give him the He has to live. The reason he has to live, he wants to become God. That's why he called Kel Acher. He wants to become God in a sense, you see.
But he has more
How?
input than we do.
What happens is follows, fundamentally. Obviously, it's a very difficult thing to maneuver a malach into a state of Hester. And I believe what happened was essentially the following. Is that the transformation of the Sultan said that the Sultan now came from being a malach to being a force of evil. Now there's a different story over here. The Sultan by other mission Kedem Achet, or as he serves the Hanagas HaMishpat, is a force for the Hanagas HaMishpat. He's a force for Bechira. But he's not a force for evil as such in that kind of way. Over here, what happened was his personality, if I may say so, was changed. And he became an evil being from his very core. Now, an evil being is a being which wants to hurt or destroy for the pure purpose of pain. Pain, of his own pleasure. His pleasure is absolute pain, or absolute churban. That's a very hard thing to be massive, really. It is. Because that you have a being, like there's nothing else that has that, really, except there are certain beings, and Amalek has that. See, the Germans had that in the kind of way, you know? It's like, for example, if you were in a room with Hitler, you sit in the room, and he knew you were Jewish, or let's say you had payas and this and that, and he was looking at you, and he looks at you through his eyes, you knew that through those eyes is like pure evil, in a sense. He was looking at you simply with the purpose, how can I cause you the greatest amount of pain? That is my pleasure. That is a purely evil being. Now, therefore, the Yetzer Hara was given this personality. He is a Ra. Now, it is the natural tendency of something which is evil to do evil. The Rebbeinu Shalom is a Toiv, and therefore the Rebbeinu Shalom is native, the exact opposite. You see. Now, the question is, when a being is evil by his nature, you see, how does that kind of a being look at the Rebbeinu Shalom? How does an evil being look at the Rebbeinu Shalom? What?
As a competitor.
Wait a minute. What does that mean? Let's think. How does he look at the Baruch Hashem? That's not the point. It's not a question of being a competitor. He becomes a competitor only because he thinks that the Baruch Hashem is no longer absolute.
Just something that Heter doesn't go to the point where he doesn't.
No. That's not what. That's the Baruch Hashem is a nebula. You're missing the essential point. You remember when I once said, "What is the essential nakuda of Elokus?" What? No. That's not it. What defines a God?
The Shlem. The fact that it controls everything.
Yeah, well,
everything means anything.
Independence.
Absolute.
Independence. Independence means that he needs nothing else. Everything which he needs is in himself. That's absolute rulership. That's absolute power, and that's absolute independence. You see what I'm saying? That's what means Elokus. That's what we said the problem of the neshama was. Because it has an aspect of independence. Since it has awareness, it's separate. Remember we said that. That's what defines as the aspect. Now, when a malach looks at the Baruch Hashem and so on, he sees the koyach, the incredible independence. He sees pure existence in front of him, to the extent that he can see it. And he knows that this being needs nothing else. It is total unto itself. It is totally powerful. It is totally separate. In the sense that it is existence itself. It doesn't even need something for its own existence. It doesn't even need existence for its existence. And for those who've been here, I will understand what I'm saying. Because he is existence. You see. Now, so then when a malach looks at the Baruch Hashem, he's staggered by this incredible perfection in front of him. And that's the kind of G'nai L'Ma'abor. That's called Hasogas Yichudoi. He's mastered the Yichud of Baruch. He's mastered the unity of God because he's mastered the notion of his independence. Something which is totally independent is absolutely one. There's nothing else but it. Eino Id Milvadoi. When the Malach looks at the Baruch Hashem, he's also margish the toiv, the tremendous toiv that emanates from that essence as well. Part of that yichud is also the toiv which comes out. You see. So along with the notion of its yichud, he feels the hatova, and that tova is part of the yichud. It's part of the being itself. He feels it all coming out. Now what happened with Yitzhak, since he was made an evil being, what happens? He looks at a being which is toiv, but he cannot understand toiv. There's nothing in his nature which could understand this notion of toiv. So when this incredible hatova is coming out of the Baruch Hashem, he's blind. It's like being colorblind. Nothing is coming at him. You see? Please. Nothing is coming at him. It means he doesn't see this hashpor of hatova coming at him. He doesn't understand it. It's not there. He's not capable of that experience. So therefore, what happens is, when he looks at the Baruch Hashem, he sees the Baruch Hashem in a half measure. He only sees half of the Baruch Hashem. There's a piece of him which he doesn't see. So therefore, he sees Masi the Baruch Hashem as a chasson, in a state of chasson. You see what I'm saying? If he's Masi the Baruch Hashem in a state of chasson, it means that the Baruch Hashem needs something else. He feels that there's something wrong. This perception that he has of God, or the Baruch Hashem, there's something wrong with it. It's mechutza something. If it's mechutza something, this cannot be the Baruch Hashem. So therefore he says, if that's not the Baruch Hashem, then I have a chance. You see? That's how it goes. The fact that the Baruch Hashem made him into an evil being means that he cannot be margish to Baruch Hashem in his shlemus. If he can't be margish to Baruch Hashem in his shlemus, he's margish in b'chason. To be margish to Baruch Hashem is not to be margish to Baruch Hashem, because the definition of God is shlemus. So therefore, Yeshoid Milvadoi, there could be something else but God. Why? Because there is no God. Because the true definition of God is that there cannot be something else. That's the nature of a God. The essence of Elikus is that there is nothing else beside it. You see. Once you see the Baruch Hashem in a state of chassan, which is what he sees, you see, then there is no Elokus really. There's simply an all-power, there's simply a very powerful being. That's how he looks at God. He looks at God like Superman. That's how he sees God. God is Superman. You know, God is someone to contend with, mind you. You know, I mean, you don't just walk into the arena there and, you know, and put your hands, you know. God is a force to be dealt with, you see. But he will deal with it. Why is God a force to be dealt with? Because there is no God, really. You see, this is the essence of Yahadus. You see, the essence of Yahadus in the Situ Acho, in the Satan. And what I mean is the following.
either you believe there is a God, or you believe there is no God. There is no middle ground. You see, that's the point. There is no middle ground. If you believe there's a God, you see, that's one thing. If you don't believe there's a God, you cannot believe that there are two gods. You see, it's not when you say Hashema Yisrael Hashem Echad, we're not saying that there's one God and there's not two gods. There is not two gods. You see, we're saying that there cannot be two gods. To say there are two gods is to say there are no gods, because the definition of God is total independence. You see, total independence, absolute power in that kind of sense, absolute separation. You cannot have two beings which are absolutely separate, as such. You cannot, because it means that each one is existence itself. You can't have two existences, there's only one pure existence. You see, and that's the point of the Sitra Achra. The Satan looks at the Bnei Shalom and he says, wait, what have I here? Who? This is an incredible, powerful being. You see, the truth is he's much more powerful than I am. But I have a way to make myself powerful too. Why did he say that? And how do I do that? By getting man to sin. The more man sins, the more powerful I become, the greater the fact I actually become a Superman too. The Satan doesn't want to become a God because he knows he cannot become a God. To be God means that you don't have to fill yourself up with iris to get bigger. You already got them to begin with. You were born with them. That's what it means to be God. The fact that he's got to fill himself with God means that he knows he's Mechusa. But he knows he can be a Superman. Oh, so if you're a Superman, who says if you're a Superman you can ruin the world? Because the truth of the matter is, there is nothing else in the world but Superman. There's one other Superman who lives on the other side of the street over there. Someday I'll be bigger than him. You see, who is that other Superman? That's the Rebbeinu Shalom. How does he see the Rebbeinu Shalom as a Superman? Because he sees only evil. So he cannot see the Hatova of the Rebbeinu Shalom. And therefore he cannot see the absolute shlemus of the Rebbeinu Shalom. So therefore it's like a blind spot. It's like a spot of the Rebbeinu Shalom that cannot be known.
He sees nothing.
No,
that's
not true. He sees the other midas that come out. The Chochmah, the Koyach, the Chayim. There are a lot of other Koyachs that come out of the Rebbeinu Shalom. No, it's yes. You see, the point is, it is all one thing. You see, but what it is if he blocks out one of these facets, then fundamentally he blocks out the aspect that the Rebbeinu Shalom is all perfect unity, or he is all his midas itself.
Doesn't he know that there is a Rebbeinu Shalom? He can't see it.
No, he doesn't. He knows that there's another Superman that lives across the street.
How does he know? What does he see?
He sees it. He experiences it.
But then to say that he doesn't appreciate Tom, right?
No, yes. So therefore he can't appreciate
He can't appreciate any kind of unity, any chachma or das or anything like that. Just evil and disorder and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah. So therefore what he perceives when he experiences the Rebbeinu Shalom, he experiences the Rebbeinu Shalom in a state of chasson, because he's blocking out an essential feature of the Rebbeinu Shalom himself.
Rebbeinu Shalom was not a Tov, it could still be why not?
Because
one second, could it be possible, conceivably, to have all those characteristics and not have a Tov?
Who?
No, why not?
Because that's the essence of Elokus.
What is it? One second.
Because
To be Toiv is part plain, blank, neutral.
No.
Non-Toiv.
No.
Why?
Because that is the definition of Shlemus. The definition of Shlemus, total perfection, means pure Hatava. I won't go into that. That's a whole.
You should know that.
I know.
You were once going to discuss it. We never went over that.
I never.
It's the beginning still.
In a sense, but one aspect is to be perfectly. You see, because you know what goodness
So
is.
being-
Because I'll
well
explain
being,
a little bit. What does it mean, goodness? Really, good. Goodness is shlemus. You know when a person really feels great? When he's shlemus. When there's nothing missing. When everything is where it's supposed to be. The person has a sense of well-being. That's so. Tov is the same thing as shlemus. You see, when you're not worried or insecure or nervous about anything, when everything you want, you have. I don't mean only in terms of your needs, but in terms of what you are. When you are the fullest of what you could be, and you are there, that is the greatest state of Hatova, because you are in a state of perfection. The Buddhism, who is the essence of Hatova, or the essence of perfection, generates the essence of Hatova itself. You see. For the Sitra Achra to block off that feature of Hatova, because he's a Meiriah, he can't see it. It's to block off that Nakuda. So therefore he sees the Rebbeinu Shalom in a state of Chasson. He cannot be margish, the Shlemus which is coming at him. So therefore, what is it? So therefore it cannot be God. If he's not God, he's Superman.
Yeah, no, and see,
So what does
So therefore, I can be Superman.
No,
You see?
He cannot interpret. He cannot interpret the Hakavah, and therefore he interprets it as a chisaron, and it's not that
Yes.
something is missing.
Because because the Hatova comes out with the shlemus, that which is perfect is automatically perfectly good. You know what I mean? To have goodness in you, to be toiv in you, is to be b'shlemus. It's another side of the same coin in a sense. You see, pure goodness is pure. For example, like I say, that's what beauty is. Beauty, when you see something beautiful, beauty is goodness, isn't it? Because it's perfect harmony, or perfect balance, or unity. So it generates a concept of perfection. Everything is the way it should be. It's beautiful. It's good. When you hear a fantastic symphony, it's good. Because there's such incredible regularity or pattern about it. So if the Bunisham is the essence of Shlemus, he's the essence of Hatova. You see?
What does he see then?
Who?
The Satan, what does he see?
It doesn't what he experiences. He experiences a being who's very powerful, but who is mechusa.
What does he see? I mean, how does he know that Hashem exists at all?
No, he sees the way all Malachim see. I don't know how they see. They see. Look, you see me. How do you see me? You see me, why? No, because the light waves that enter your mind, they create one. So there's a whole mechanism of experience, right? Malachim also have some kind of mechanism of experience, or mechanism of sensation. It's not the sensation that we have of each other. You see? You have the five senses, right? Malachim have also senses. They have. But I don't know what they are. They are accurate of whatever the guf of a malach is, whatever the substance and the structural position of a malach is. So Gavril is malach to Bonishim also with his sensory process, whatever that is. The Satan has a similar kind of sensory process as the malach. The problem is that it's got a blind spot in it. So when the stimulus, when the sensation of the Bonishim is coming into the malach, like half of it is missing, part of it is cut out. There's part of the image, half of the retina is missing. You see? So only half of the image is processed in the mind. Well, if half the image is processed in the mind, you can't be talking about God. A God is not a half thing.
He does know that God has to be b'shleimus. That he does know.
No, he does know that. Yes, that he knows. He knows that. Sure, he knows that. He knows that. He knows what shleimus is. But he's saying whatever shleimus is, that being doesn't have it. But he thinks that being doesn't have it. He thinks that being doesn't have it because of the problem in the being. He doesn't know the reason why the being doesn't have it because of the problem in his eyes.
But he also thinks that he cannot be God as well.
What?
He knows that he cannot be God, right?
Yes, that he knows.
Because he needs all his nourishment.
But he
doesn't have to be a Superman.
Yeah, a Superman. But that's not bad. Second one up is not bad. No, he's not that fool. He does not. It's not a fool that he really thinks he can be a God. Although that also can be disputed. But I won't dispute that at this point because you don't know enough. There is an aspect of godless in that sense, so there is an aspect. But there is a toss that he makes that he can be a God, but not in a real sense. But there is a toss that he does make. But as far as we're concerned, he feels that he can be a Superman. And that's essentially what it is. So that's the thing. All the Bonishim has to do is change the inside, transform the Sherish to Ra, and automatically the Malach goes off. And he cannot see anymore. The whole sensory process is damaged. Once you think Yeshua Milvadoy and you're a Maria, well, let's go get it. Where do I get it? Where do I get this Purach to be a Superman? Aha, mankind. That's where the food is. Let's go. Let's get it. But they all say, go for it.
You seem to be saying that if he wouldn't have this Maria, if he wouldn't go for it as strong.
He wouldn't, yeah. No, if he didn't have this...
That's what you seem to be saying.
Well, the thing
that
is...
the Maria gives him a certain, more of a oomph, or
impetus.
Yes.
And without that, he wouldn't do it? He wouldn't go with that
thing? That's a what actually motivates him? What motivates him, no question... That's a good question. What motivates him is no question is the fact that he's mechusa himself. See, every malach is shalem. This is the problem also. Every malach is shalem. He's created b'shlemus. Only man has got to go from matzav chesron to matzav shlemus. Only man. Because only mankind was created mechusa in a real way. Malachim were created b'shlemus really, because they are what they are. They don't get bigger, they don't get smaller. They are what they are.
They're shluchim,
and that's the end of it. The Satan, once he was made of Maria or Ra, he's now in a state of chesron. That state of chesron provides the impetus to be mashlim himself. Except that he's mashlim himself according to Ta'usim that he makes. He's mashlim himself according to the fact that he thinks he can become a Yeshed Mavadai. And he runs after it.
So he's also, through Kilkel, he went a step lower by not being a Shalom.
Yes. That is what I believe is fundamentally, there's a lot more, it's very deep, I mean, the truth, we're going to a very, very deep Indian here because we're trying to understand the essence here of the Sitrach himself. And I mean, obviously, this is a very deep, you know, we're not going to go. But fundamentally, I believe that this is really what happened. This is how the transformation took place. You see, and that's what it says. Take your feet off means that you're not a normal malach. A normal malach, where does a normal malach live? In the Shemayim. What does it mean? It's Masik Yechudai. You see, when your feet are cut off, you live on the earth. What's the main feature of someone who lives on the earth? You're not Masik Yechudai, because there's a Hester. That's what it meant. The Nachash was put into the Satan was put into a Hester. How can a Malach be put into a Hester? You see, and given the drive to run after someone else. Because somehow there was a state of Chasson put into him. And that state of Chasson, which is the Ra, first of all, creates the Hester, because he can't, you see. That has to do now. So therefore we see that what determines the history of all these Ummahs Olam, in many cases has to do with the connections that they will have Jews with Jews throughout history. So what is very important is to study world history and Jewish history on the side and watch the two threads. Do you know what I mean?
Synchronology.
The synchronology, exactly. And how the two threads are continuously merging. And that will tell us a tremendous amount of hashgacha. For example, sometimes the Jews will be in 60, sometimes in 68, sometimes they'll go on to 35. Why? What determines the shift? What determines the quality of Gullus? What determines the particular kind of Gullus that the Rebbeinu chooses at that point in time? You see, this is all part of it. You cannot begin to understand that until you first understand this. You see, and even if you understand this, you can't begin to understand the history until you understand where 60 is now and where 60 was throughout history. You see what I'm saying? That's the beginning of the puzzle to explain all of human history. I don't know if you realize what I'm painting in front of you is a vast picture, you see, of tremendous potential to begin to understand the inner workings of history itself. Much as we did last week in the thing with the Erevav, in a sense, you see. But this is really big business.
In the Torah anthropology,
in a sense.
It has to do with history.
What's that?
The anthropology of the Torah has a lot to do with determinants of history because it's rooting Teres and Nefesh of all the Olam in their behavior.
Now you people do not know enough at this time really to understand what the importance is of the Ummah Olam vis-a-vis Yisrael. You see, that we will discuss later on, when we connect that to the Hanagas HaYichud. See, that's the other thing that's going on here. Because the Hanagas HaYichud does a whole different job. That's where you begin to understand a great deal of what goes on. You see, but right now we don't. We just see the basic picture of Mishpah, how it influences all the Ummah Olam, how it determines fundamentally their culture and their Hatzlach in Olam Hazeh, and basically their position in Olam Hazeh vis-a-vis Olam Haba in terms of Geras, Chassidim Ummah Olam, and so on and so forth. Are there any questions? France on this list. The Jews in India. Where is India on that list? We don't know, you see. So therefore we don't know the significance of where the Jews are. Forget about where they're not. You see, if we don't know where India or China or France or Britain or these things, we don't know where they are.
I don't understand the relevance to that.
The relevance to that is the fact that the Jews are where they are for a specific reason.
Right.
And the reason that they are that way is in some way to either do one of two functions. Either to be remove the tumah that comes on them from the chatoim, or to bring down a kedusha on them to elevate the neshamas. Those are the two things that every Jew does one of two jobs. Either he's removing tumah which is on his neshama, or he's bringing down new eretz through mitzvahs to elevate his neshama. You see, if we know where a Jew is, we can some degree tell us what he's doing there. You see. But there are a lot of other things we can say also that you'll see later on. There are many other things, but that question will be answered later on. There are many things that you can see from that.
The exceptions that we brought up before about the Saudi Arabians, for example, or even looking at Germany today.
Yes, you can't. That exception has to do with the following fact. We discussed the model or the paradigm of the Ummah Olam, right? According to the concept of Mishpat. You see, we discussed the concept of the Ummah Olam coming from the Shroshim. You see, and how the Ashurim determine the different Ummas, the number of Ummas, and the factors that determine But there is another factor which runs this thing, and that's the fact of Yichud. That's a totally different thing, you see. That factor is what jumbles up the whole picture. That's what does it. Remember I told you once how another yichud works? It takes the head and turns over the body, and the feet are up, and the head is on the floor. It's a reverse way of doing it. And that entry of that leader into the picture is what complicates the situation. It can take an ummah which is here and give it the hatzlacha of an ummah which is here. You see? That's what goes on. What?
How about on an individual level? We said that the person is here, right? A guy, and this is his own conduct for his deeds in this world, right?
There's a certain given, and there's a certain given from the shurish, but there are other things. He also has the ability to change his olam hazeh. For example, one important thing, even within all these different ummahs, right? There are some goyim who are very matzliach, and there's some who are not matzliach at all, right? There's some very rich goyim and some very poor, some who suffer, some who have mazel. In every one of these situations, right? There are all in the Eskimos, right? Wherever the Eskimos are, and I don't think they're too high. But wherever they are, right? You find some Eskimos which are the chief of the tribe, right? He's got all the cover, he's got all the wives, or he's got all the mammon, or whatever the story is. He's having a great time, right? How do you get over there? You got another Eskimo who's on welfare in the Eskimo land, or whatever that is. What? He gets fish stamps, seal stamps. Christmas seals, literally.
But how does that relate to what they do in this world? You see a lot of people that really don't do anything. You don't know what people are really.
You don't know because you don't see the problem here. There are many factors here. This entire picture is really the explanation from one factor. Let me tell you something important thing about analysis. Let me tell you something very important thing about how to analyze something, about reality. Reality, when you look at an event, a phenomena, you will never see a phenomena which is simple, meaning a phenomena which is caused by one thing, Most of the time, a phenomena is very complex. What I mean is, there are a lot of things going on at the same time that are caused by many things. So if you want to understand an event, right, it is a very difficult thing to do, really. The way to do it is to try and separate all the different factors first and connect those factors to their causes on a simple basis and then build up. So what we do is we first analyze, we break down the reality according to its basic components, and then we analyze each component. What does each component do? What can each component do by itself? And once we understand that, we put it all back together again. Presto, you have the entire phenomena. You see? It's the same thing here. When we look out at the world, we see the Ummah Olam, the Goyim, the Jews, we see a staggering array of variation. And we say, why? Why is this guy rich and that guy poor? And this boy is healthy and he's what determines all this? You see? What happens is it? So the answer is, when we look at it, we say, your question is very simplistic, because it seems to say, well, there's like one reason why. You see what I'm saying? That's the implication. That's a very simplistic way to do it. You see? For example, just to do it, Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was Tama Goy at one time, and Elvis Presley suddenly, he was very engaged. What?
A truck driver.
He was a truck driver. Suddenly one day, and some of the models that he had suddenly elevated him to the #1 super rock star singer of America. He started rocking all over America. This one guy. So he found himself as a multi-millionaire suddenly, and now that he was the head of a whole movement. He influenced incredibly the whole culture of an ummah. You see, now, why was Elvis Presley zecher to such a zach? And it was a schutz. What? Okay, that's something else. He could have been mazalzel the schutz.
Why would we say something else?
What? When he first got the schutz, it could have been because of a certain koyach. That's not true. It could have been emes schutz. Because the man was moedik matzliach. Hatzlacha to a goy in Olam Hazeh is a schutz. You see, now along the way he can be mazalzel too. He can destroy it. So he dies at 42, and whatever the story is, these on whatever the story. That's something else. We're not concerned what he did with that schutz. The point is that he started. Now, why did Elvis Presley start that way? What made him to be that way? There is no one answer why. Why? Because what made Elvis Presley have to do with it? Where did he come from? You see, in terms of mishpat, where was he doing in terms of yichud? Many ways to answer that. You see. There are many factors which are answering this. We don't know, you see. We don't know clearly, but you cannot understand it until you first break it down. You got to say to yourself, in any specific individual, what are the fundamental factors which determine his Matzav in Olam Hadeh. You see, well, number one, there's his shurish. We see that the shurish, where he comes from, who his Zayda was, right, has to say, there's a big say of what's going to happen to him. Number one. Number two, his Bechira, his Maisim, you see. And number three, we don't know that this necessarily is his first Gilgul. Maybe he was here in this world before, you see. Maybe he was a Rosh before, or a Tzaddik before. So therefore now he's here on a different time because of that. So there's the Indian of a Gilgul, or a Tikkun that he has to establish for another Gilgul. So you got three different reasons there. You see. You got his Shurish, his Maisim, and then his Tikkunim that he has to do. And then there's a fourth thing also, Yichud. Many times the Yichud will take a person and make him rich even though he doesn't deserve it. Because it needs it for the entire Bria. And has its own cheshbonos. You know what I mean? Or sometimes it'll take a person and make him very poor. Fakir. Tzadik v'laloi. What's called mazel. You see.
We understood how that works with a yid because in the end it's going to even out. Right?
But it also works with
he's going to die and that's it.
Yeah, but it also evens out with a goy also. Goyim are used also in the same way. It's not so much, they also have to, there are other things that they still have to involve also. It's not an open and shut picture over here in that kind of sense. But what I'm simply basically trying to say is that whenever you want to analyze something, what you must first do is analyze the thing into its components. And then isolate the components, each one, and try and understand the component in its entirety. And then the next step is to re-synthesize the components into the event itself. That's how you understand something. And that's what we're doing. You see, the thing we're trying to study is the phenomena called the Umas Olam. And we want to say to ourselves, what determines the motive of the Umas Olam? In order to understand that, we know that it's a complex event. We first must isolate fragments, analyze it into its components, and this is one of its components. One of the components of the Indian of the Umas Olam is the concept of Mishpat as it relates to the Shurish. That's one of the components. And then we do is isolate the component, which we did here, and expand on it. What are all the different ways it manifests itself? So we understand how Mishpat works over here. Then we have to finish this thing. Next time we have to go to a new factor and see what it does. And then finally we take all the factors together and put it together and begin to build some kind of a picture of why things are happening the way they do. Do you understand? That's the process. Yes.
Yeah, I've been following most of this. There's one thing that I know it's out there. I just can't get a handle on the yichud aspect of it. I mean, I know that you've had it made, and I know it's there, and I know I understand this whole thing. But is there an English term that I could start honing in on, or something that I could?
Yichud.
Yeah, I mean, it's this other element outside of all of this.
Yeah.
Which turns everything upside down.
That's the Hanugas HaYichud. That Hanugas HaYichud is essentially the hashkocha, the hanhoga, or the behavior that the Rebbeinu Shalom manifests in the world in order to save it. In order to be matzalah, to save it.
But why does it always look backward? Why does it stand itself on its head?
I mean, why does it work the way it does?
Right. Why does it,
Yeah, you understand it's objective. The objective is to say,
right.
The shayla, you want to understand the nature of its process. That's what you want to know.
Anxious to say, it only comes when it happens.
That is...
But it's happening every moment, obviously.
Every moment. That's a very complex question, and that's something later on. You'll just have, at this point we have to accept the way it works. Why it works that way has a lot to do with the whole nature of Bechira and the nature of the Yetzer Hara himself and so on, which we put aside in that kind of sense. We took a
possibly the Nitzvi Yisum too.
Nitzvi Yisum, it's a complex thing. It's a very difficult thing. Why it happens on its head and so on. But there are a lot of other things that have to go before that to be understood. We skipped a little bit. What we did is we went into the Umas Olam, we took a complex subject, and I'm trying to give an explanation of it, which we're doing. But perforce, certain of the terms have to remain undefined. It's enough at this point to understand its objective of the Yichud and its process, the way it works. Why it works that way is something else, But I have to leave that at this point.
How far away from it?
I don't know. Well, another few more. It's an incentive for you to continue to reappear. Let's say the Goyim in the Roman times. There were many Goyim there with incredible mashchitzim, the Romans, with the Colosseum and and all the stuff there. I mean, the Romans were Roitzim and so on. These Goyim, right, they had a Bechira. They fouled the Bechira up. Okay, they brought in a tremendous amount of hashchos into the Bria. Not in terms of the Jews. A Goy cannot affect a goy's hashchasa cannot affect the Jew. What kills the Bria is the Jew, not the goy. Once the goy was taken out of the category of number 71, just like a goy cannot be mezachik the Bria, he cannot be metama the Bria. He can't. A goy, I don't care what a goy does, he cannot touch the Bria. He doesn't have the ability. His fingers up. You know what I mean? All he can do is he can affect a couple of items here and there, but he can't. All the good in the world cannot affect what one Jew can do with one chet. You see, that's the power of a Jew in that sense, through the koyach of his nefesh in that sense. But the man in his own realm, he can affect the bria in terms of the goyish belt significantly. The Romans at that time, all the ritzichas they did and so on, they brought in a tremendous amount of shchos in the bria. In a certain sense, they took the earth that they had, whatever they had left, and they gave it over to a much larger degree of tumah. You see, so the din demanded that they take it back. So, for example, a whole bunch of goyim are reborn 2,000 years later in Cambodia, let's say, and suddenly a guy comes up, Pol Pot comes over, and he kills 3 million Cambodians like a bunch of sheep. Who were those goyim? You see. Who were those goyim? Those are, those are the goyim. Let's say we don't know exactly, but these are the goyim that were ma'abed the bria, way long time ago, that had to bring back the bria, because the bria must always lie on a balance. You see, you can't just say kedusha and destroy it. You can't. You are condemned to retrieve it. You see. And if you attempt to exile it, to destroy it, through your Maisim Royim, you must retrieve it through your Yisurim. The Shver Dinam. And when you look at the world, you see tremendous suffering of Goyim. And that's the thing. Some Yenim Goy thinks an incredible, that's the others of the Goy. He thinks that they think they can go on killing people, along with their Ritzichas, and they don't pay back. It's an unbelievable thing. They don't realize the tremendous what they're going to have to pay back. They think that they can go scot-free. For example, that they, you find.
You want to use it?
Another example. You find that in the 1,000 years of Jewish history, right? The last 1,000 years, the Jews lived in Europe. How many pogroms there were? Like in the 16th century, the Khmelnytsky pogrom. They killed over 100,000 Jews, right? What happened to all those Cossacks? Where are they? We don't know. But who knows that Cossacks were part of the 20 million Goyim that were just killed by Khrushchev as he wiped them all out? You see? Or Stalin. You know, the camps that Stalin killed millions and millions of Russians. Who knows that they were the Gilgulim of the original? You know what I mean? You know, the old Mida connected Mida. You know? It does. The Monishim does not sit there and look away. You know? Any guy who thinks that he can play his game now and do what he wants, he thinks he can kill someone and do it. He doesn't realize that he will die that Mishum Mishuna someday also. He will go through the fire just like he put that guy through the fire. And if he knew that, he'd be so geschrocken, he'd mamish be a tzaddik. That's the thing. They don't realize that. Yeah.
In the same way that we say that a poor person exists for the benefit of allowing another person to give to him, to give. Why can't we say this about these 70 nations? Why can't we say that a nation which is poor, somewhere down at the bottom of the line, because they're lacking something, nutrients from their environment, why can't we say that that exists for the purpose of the ones on top to give? And then what happens when the ones on top
well, they don't exist to give. There's no concept of giving. There's the only concept here is to massacre certain things. The fact that there are distinctions of levels means that there's a have and a have not. Right. But there's no meaning of giving. The punishment is not. Let me tell you something. When you see an ani, there's a man who's sitting. He's very poor, right? He's very poor, right? And you have a choice to give him stuff or not. Do you think that man was made poor so that you can give? Of course not.
Not totally. I mean, part of it
no.
Is totally, not totally, but in part, yes.
No, not in part at all.
Not
Who do you think you are? That well, I mean this. I don't mean personally. Who does the person think he is? That some other guys that are light on Nias, so that he can walk along and drop a penny in his sucker box.
They think do it like that.
Who? Even if he gives it, that doesn't matter. No person suffers an unglik so somebody else can have a covered on it. Every person has his own din. Now it happens to be that if a person has the gzeir of aniyas and he suffers poverty, you see, that the Bereshim is mazaka somebody else with a mitzvah in that kind of sense. You see. But it doesn't mean that the oni was created. In that the oni was made You see, for that exact purpose, Anias is created because Neshamas created a state of Anias. That's why. Because to a person's Maisim, he has the life he's soon of being an Ani. You see.
But what happens if we don't give? If we have nothing to give?
Well, that's one of the ways you masaking yourself is by giving. That's true. You know, the Bereshit took advantage of the opportunity of poverty in order to increase the schus of other people. But he didn't necessarily create poverty for that purpose as such. Although once it's there, he is taking advantage of that fact. That is true. There is an advantage to be gained by the have and have not situation.
So why can we say that exists over here?
It does, in that sense. That the Bereshit does take advantage of that so that other ummas can be stuck to the low ummas. That's true, it does.
So what I'm saying is...
But these ummas are poverty stricken on because of their shroshim and because of their maisim loyim. Not so that these ummas on top can give them succor.
No, I didn't mean that was a total picture. I meant that, for sure, maybe that somebody causes the Torah that comes to him, he causes it himself.
Yes.
Once it's there...
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Once it's there, the same thing over there, right. You have that aspect. Fine. Now, what we're going to do now is to go into the again, the topic is the Ummas Ha'olam, but we're going to examine the Ummas Ha'olam from a totally different perspective, and this is a very critical aspect, and it is from this perspective, that we're going to begin to understand how the Ummas Ha'olam relate to Klal Yisrael throughout the course of human history. Now, first of all, before we get to the Ummas Ha'olam, we have to understand something about the Hanagas HaYichud. And like I once said before, the Hanagas HaYichud is a very difficult midah to understand. But the fundamental principle of the Hanagas HaYichud is the following: that the greater the chatoim, then the greater the shlita or the power of the Satan. One follows directly from the other. The greater the power and the shlita of the Satan, then certain things happen which bring Klal Yisrael closer to your Yeshua. Now, we want to describe this, I think, briefly last time.
That's paradoxical.
Yes. And the concept of Be'ita or Be'achishena. Remember we discussed that? And that concept is very critical, because what that concept really says is that the tikkun of the Bria can go in two different directions, essentially. And both directions lead to the same point. We had, I think, a whole thing, you remember this? And I can't ever overemphasize it enough, because this is really what goes on to a large extent. The first concept which leads in a certain direction is essentially the concept of Achishena, you see. This really concept is the notion of Bechira, you see, and it leads to the notion of a tikkun. There's another concept called Be'ita, you see, which is the notion of time, which uses a different principle, but also establishes the concept of tikkun in the same way. What does Be'ita use? What does that mean? Be'ita, what does it use actually? It uses the Hanagas HaYichud, you see. This uses the Hanagas HaMishpat, essentially.
Okay.
The tikkun comes out of the Mishpat. Here the tikkun comes out of what's called Yichud. Okay? But instead of Bechira, it uses another concept. It uses the concept called, and this is the basic word over here, we'll call it Tigboris Hara, or the extension or the amplification of Ra, or the Koyach of the Satan. Let me just go through this. This is a very critical point. You see, the word Iten Achishena, of course, are used in reference to Yemos Mashiach, but it doesn't matter. What they really refer to are the principles of how the tikkun is reached. Okay? The tikkun is either reached through Mishpat, Alidei Bechiro, or through Yichud, Alidei what's called Tigboris Hara. Now, this is the principle which we'll look into now. One of the ways in which the Hanogas HaYichud works. Okay. Fundamentally, what happens is like this. Let's say you have a neshama, okay? Now, when a neshama does a chet, what happens? Again, what happens? Essentially, when it does a chet, the person leans over to the Yetzer Hara. Then what happens is the neshama is lowered. It's lowered in the following way. The person, by adhering to a chet, adheres to a certain koyach of tumah. And that koyach of tumah becomes dovek to him. It becomes mizdabek to him. And that's called a klipa in the technical language and so on. So what happens is, when he does a chet, a certain part of him in a sense gets like a klipa, or it's almost like a scab, if you want to call it a shell. It's like a scab that comes on a part of the neshama. Now, what does that do? What that does is the following. That normally, if a person would do a mitzvah, then what's the effect of a mitzvah? Who remembers what the effect of a mitzvah is? What? Yes. He's mamshich oris. Very important to all remember that. A mitzvah brings down oris from the shemayim and invigorates the neshama. And why does it need to be invigorated for? Because fundamentally, what's the ultimate tachlis of the neshama? What? Zichor, right. The neshama cannot be mezachach anything unless it has that power. And it gets that power from the oris. And it gets those oris from mitzvahs. When it's dovik to kedusha, it gets that all. Okay? Now, what happens when he does a chet? Those oris, what happens? Normally when a person does a chet, those oris should not come down. They should not come down. Mishpat fundamentally says that the oris really should not come down, basically. But what Yichud says is the following, that the oris they let them come down. But what happens is they come down and they go into the neshama to the point of where that chet was, and the oris go into that klipa itself. Which means that the tumah, the oris, the kedusha, that oris which normally would give a certain power to the neshama, goes into the Satan himself. What I mean, directly into many feeders that he has, or into his entire realm. What does that do? That invigorates it or strengthens the Satan. He becomes much more powerful. Very powerful from that kind of action. That process is called Yunika. Yonik means to feed, to be yonik, to feed. And essentially this is the way the Satan is yonik. Now, let's explain what we mean by this. From the Chet of Adam Rishon. When the Satan was first created, right? When he was first created, he was created in a certain way. He had a certain koyach. Where did the Satan get his koyach from? The Satan had a certain shlichus. He was a malach that had certain shlichus. And he had a certain koyach. His koyach was to attempt to seduce men so that they do chatoim. That's what his koyach, that was his tachlis and so on.